Hi guys. This video will help you understand a little bit better what goes on in the human respiratory system, the different parts of the respiratory system, and also why it's important for us. Now, the main purpose of the human respiratory system is to allow for gas exchange. Now, we often think about breathing as taking in oxygen, and that's absolutely true. Our body needs oxygen because each one of our cells burns sugars and other materials using a process that requires oxygen. However, that cellular respiration process also produces waste gases. That waste gas is CO2. And that CO2 is a poisonous waste product that has to be gotten rid of from our body. So our respiratory system is not only going to be taking in the oxygen we need, it's also going to be letting out the CO2 that we're producing. And in fact, if you try holding your breath, the first thing that you do when you stop holding your breath is actually breathe out. It's not breathe in. You don't go, oh my gosh, I need more oxygen. You breathe out because your body actually regulates your breathing by sensing the amount of CO2 that's building up in your bloodstream. And it wants to get rid of that CO2. That's actually the drive that pushes you to breathe. Now, as we look at the respiratory system, the most important part of that respiratory system is going to be the gas exchange structures, and those are our lungs. Different organisms have different kinds of gas exchange structures. Something like a fish uses gills, tiny, thin bits of tissue with lots of blood vessels that can exchange gases with the liquid environment. Our lungs, like those tiny, thin pieces of tissues in the gill, actually have a lot of surface area to allow a lot of gas exchange. But they're contained inside our thoracic cavity, inside our chest cavity. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One, it keeps your lungs from drying out. Anyone who's been breathing a lot, exercising a lot, or talking a lot, especially on a cold, dry day, will notice that they're getting a little bit dry. Lungs need to be wet in order to exchange gas as well. If they were on the outside of our body, they'd dry out really, really quickly, and they wouldn't be very good. They'd also be subject to a lot of damage. If your lungs were hanging out on the outside of your body, they'd be really easy targets and they'd get punctured and all sorts of nasty things would happen. We keep them protected inside so that A, they keep moist without us losing a lot of water, and B, they stay protected. Now, inside our lungs, there are a variety of tiny chambers. Now, if we think about the anatomy of our respiratory system, what we're trying to do is get gases down into our lungs and then have as many opportunities as possible to absorb the oxygen and release CO2. So we want our lungs to actually have as big of a surface area as possible. They're not just empty balloons. They actually have a really complex structure. Let's take a look at the anatomy of our respiratory system. As air comes into our body, it passes through our nasal passages, which actually can filter the air a lot, much like a mask that you might be wearing to stop the spread of disease. Your nose hairs and other structures inside the nose tend to trap a lot of particles and actually keep the air relatively clean. If you're breathing through your mouth, you're actually much more likely to inhale a lot of these particles deeply down into your lungs. Whereas if you're breathing through your nose, your body basically pre-filters them. However, whichever way you breathe in, through your nose or through your mouth, these tubes join back in the back of your throat. Now, that gas passes down from the area that's shared with your digestive system down into the larynx. The larynx is your voice box. The larynx contains your vocal cords, and it's the part of your throat that you can feel vibrating when you're talking. Now, from the larynx, we pass down into the trachea, and then into what we call the bronchi. The two bronchi are the major tubes that lead to your lungs. The trachea, on the other hand, is that tough, ribbed windpipe that you feel, leading down to the bronchi. Now, those bronchi split into tinier passages known as bronchioles. And the bronchioles, in turn, terminate in little tiny air sacs called alveoli. If you imagine broccoli, that's kind of what the alveoli look like. Now, really, it's like the inverse of broccoli, where the broccoli shape, with all those tiny little heads and florets, those would be basically empty cavities, and the lung would be the rest of it. So inside your lung, it's really a spongy structure with all these tiny air sacs, known as alveoli, not just a big empty balloon. Now, the walls of these alveoli are covered with tiny blood vessels. These capillaries bring blood to the lungs that's high in CO2 so that the CO2 can be dropped off, and they allow for oxygen from that freshly taken in air to be put into your blood and then carried back to your heart and then eventually to your muscles. In this way, you can see the circulatory system, the system that's circulating our blood, really works hand in hand with the respiratory system. Without the circulatory system, the respiratory system really wouldn't be able to provide a lot of oxygen to anywhere other than, well, your lungs. They need to go together, and that's really an important thing to know. Now, the respiratory system has more than just these passages. Because the respiratory system shares the start, in other words, the area in your mouth and nose, with your digestive system, you also have this little flap of skin called the epiglottis. The epiglottis covers up the opening to your respiratory system while you're swallowing. This is why you can't really breathe while you're swallowing. And also why if you choke or cough or something like this as you're swallowing, you're likely to get food now down into, quote, the wrong pipe, and it ends up kind of lodged in the upper part of your respiratory system. The little epiglottis is a flap that normally closes as you swallow, and it's only during sort of a spasm, like a cough, where it can open accidentally that food can really get down into the respiratory system. Now, our respiratory system is something we don't think about. You've literally been breathing every second since you were born. The first thing that a doctor does, she'll hold you up and usually, it sounds a little mean, but they'll usually tap your feet or spank you on the bottom, and that gets you crying. They want to make sure that the baby is breathing well and that her lungs are functioning. Now, that said, so you've really been breathing ever since you were born, and you kind of take it for granted. How we actually accomplish breathing, though, is a little bit more complicated, and it's something we don't necessarily think about. Now, the way that we accomplish breathing is something called negative pressure breathing. That sounds complex, but it's really not. The idea is that we actually can control the size of our thoracic cavity, in other words, our chest cavity. When we breathe in, what happens is that a barrier across the bottom of the thoracic cavity, a barrier made of basically airtight connective tissue and driven by a muscle, expands downward. That barrier is known as the diaphragm. As we breathe in, the diaphragm goes down. What that does, if you look at the chest cavity, is it increases the volume of the chest cavity. Now, if you have the same amount of gas and it occupies a bigger volume, that gas doesn't have as much pressure. If there's high pressure air outside your body, or at least normal pressure air outside your body, and all of a sudden the air inside your body is at lower pressure, well, what's going to happen? Air is going to move from outside your body in an area of higher pressure to inside your body in this area of low pressure. So by lowering your diaphragm, you allow air to actually suck into your lungs. You don't gulp at the air. You don't grab it and pull it in. You just create a low pressure area inside your lungs and the air flows in. Now, this causes problems under some circumstances that we're not usually used to. For example, if you've ever tried to breathe in a really high wind, most of us would turn our back to the wind, right? So nothing blows in our eyes or something like that. If you turn your back to the wind's rushing around your head, and it creates basically a little vacuum in front of your mouth. I don't know if you've ever had this happen, but if you do this, it's really hard to breathe. If you stuck your head out the side of a car window, I don't recommend this, but if you did, and you turned the back of your head towards the way that the car was going, so the air is rushing around your head, you'd create that little vacuum. You'd actually find it very, very difficult to breathe. When we breathe out, that diaphragm goes up. The diaphragm pushes up, creating higher pressure in the thoracic cavity, the chest cavity, and forcing air out. So when we breathe in, diaphragm goes down. Breathe out, diaphragm goes up. This is often why a vocal coach or a singing instructor might tell you to sit upright, have good posture, and sing from your diaphragm. Now, I say this, you don't want to hear me sing, but at least I know that's kind of why they're saying that. Now, one of the other things to keep in mind is that this all depends on our chest cavity basically being sealed. There's a barrier, this diaphragm, separating our chest cavity from our abdomen. And we actually have a relatively strong muscle driving it up and down. You've actually probably seen this muscle, well, you may have seen this muscle in another animal. If you've ever eaten skirt steak, if you go to the grocery store, skirt steak looks a lot like flank steak, and it's usually sold in the same place. Skirt steak is actually the muscle that moves the cow's diaphragm up and down. And it's relatively lean meat because it gets a workout. Every time the cow breathes, that skirt steak is flexing the diaphragm and helping the cow breathe in. Now, if that chest cavity, in humans or cows or whatever organism that's breathing by negative pressure breathing, if that chest cavity is punctured, you end up with something really bad. Not only do you have a hole in your body, which is bad to begin with, but a hole in the thoracic cavity that breaks things up can create what's called a sucking chest wound. Now, when I was growing up, I always heard that and I thought, yeah, it would suck to have a chest wound. And that's part of it, but the idea is that when the diaphragm goes up and down, now since there's a hole in the chest cavity, the diaphragm goes down, and instead of creating this low pressure region inside the thoracic cavity and drawing air down into your lungs, what happens is the diaphragm goes down, and now the air can soak in through this little hole, and you don't end up getting as much air actually down your lungs because, well, the air is coming in and out through this little hole in the chest cavity as your diaphragm goes up and down. That's why somebody with a chest wound, like a bullet wound or a stab wound or something like that, they might actually suffocate because, well, this chest wound might be causing them to be unable to actually fill up their lungs. Also, any wound that's going to cause bleeding in the thoracic cavity has the potential to pack blood and other stuff around your lungs and really prevent them from inflating. So that would obviously be also very, very dangerous. So to recap, the respiratory system has two main functions: to take in oxygen from the environment and to eliminate CO2 that's produced through cellular respiration. Both of these functions together are known as gas exchange. The respiratory system works in conjunction with the circulatory system to move gases throughout your body. And it does so through a complex series of organs and passages that are all required to increase the surface area and increase the efficiency with which we take in and release gases. I hope this helps, and I look forward to talking to you about other topics in the future. Thanks.